Welcome to the Infinite Surface podcast. We're back after a long break with an exciting and special kind of episode. Today we have on two returning guests, Brian Booth Craig and Glenn LaVertu. They're here to discuss Chuck Close's controversial quote about inspiration. It's a quote that I use often in my classes. "Inspiration is for amateurs," says Chuck Close. "The rest of us just get up and go to work." When Glenn posted a well-contained rant about disliking the quote so much, I thought it was a perfect opportunity to see why his and Brian's view on the quote were so different than mine, and how I might think more carefully about some of the implications buried just beneath the surface. So without further ado, Episode 8 of the Infinite Surface podcast. Okay, welcome to the Infinite Surface podcast. I'm here in East Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, at the studio of Brian Booth Craig. I'm visiting Brian's studio this week, and we took the opportunity to have a podcast. I'm here with also Glenn LaVertu. Both Brian and Glenn are alumni of the podcast. So Glenn, go ahead and say hi.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and Brian?
Hi, everyone. Thanks also for having me on, Jesse.
Sure. So a while back, one of the things that I wanted to discuss here, Glenn had posted on his Facebook a quote by Chuck Close. And it's a quote that I use often in my class, that I often mention to my students. And the reason it kind of struck me that Glenn mentioned it is because he said he really didn't like it. And so I was very curious to hear about why, and maybe rethink my own position on it. So the quote by Chuck Close is, "Inspiration is for amateurs. The rest of us just show up and get to work." That's the most famous part of it. The whole quote, as I found online, I didn't check the primary source, so we'll have to look for the primary source on this. But the whole quote is, "If you wait around for the clouds to part and a bolt of lightning to strike you in the brain, you are not going to make an awful lot of work. All the best ideas come out of the process. They come out of the work itself." But Glenn, I don't think that you didn't mention the whole quote when you
right.
mentioned it. You just mentioned that first part. So let me just ask you, like, what brought that up for you, and how do you feel about it?
Well, I believe the quote comes from a Charlie Rose interview he did, the whole thing, and I had seen it. And as happens with social media, if something strikes me, I'll just post something about it. And part of why I posted it is because I know a little bit about his process. I mean, I guess we all do, but having worked for Saul LeWitt, who was very close friends actually with Chuck Close, and I only really understood what Chuck Close was doing through what Saul LeWitt was doing in the kind of systematic kind of mark making or whatever it is that he was working on. So when he said that, when I saw him say that, I thought, yeah, that's easy for you to say. It's just like a factory job. You just kind of show up, do your thing, go out, and that's that. And I don't think, I think that's unfair there's just too many different kinds of creative expressions, or processes that I feel like he's talking about one very, very specific kind of expression that really kind of fits in, the art world, the art market, right? So you got to push out the product, and he's got this great system to do that with. But, the rest of us, not everybody works that way, I mean, it's a great way to think if you have like a deadline, or if you've got things you've got to do, or you're kind of fulfilling orders, right? But, I don't know that inspiration really works that way, or rather the process of making works that way. I mean, he talks about inspiration as if it's things out in the air, but I felt, to me, what inspiration really is kind of like going into yourself, kind of finding the connections of things that you're interested in, and then coming up with an idea that builds on that. And sometimes it takes time, it's not just an instantaneous thing. But if you've got a grid I guess it's pretty instantaneous.
Who do you think he was talking to there? Like, do you think he was giving advice to, because he uses the word amateurs, which I think, if I'm not wrong, Brian's going to pick up on later. But he seems to be just, drawing a distinction between people that are having some success and people that aren't, or people that have developed a professional process and people that haven't. So do you think that he's talking to like professional, like quote unquote professional artists that haven't made it yet and are maybe like working too slowly? Or do you think he's talking to students, or who do you think he's talking to there?
Both. I know that when he was around, he used to do the circuit, he'd go to school, and he'd get that kind of question all the time. And he has that kind of maverick, suck it up sort of attitude, you know what I mean? And I'm willing to bet he thought that way of some of his, I don't want to say peers, but maybe a younger generation of artists who didn't have that same kind of, process or system.
So do you think it's kind of like a pick yourself up by your bootstraps, dismissive comment?
Totally.
Yeah. And when you're a student, because I know one of the interesting things also about reading your Facebook and tapping into your hot takes is like I have to ask that question too. Like, who is Glenn responding to, or who is he talking to? Like, is this for his students? Is this for his art career? Is this to other artists? And I know it's always all of it, but when you're dealing, like, for instance, with students who are kind of stuck or something like that, it sounds like you don't that's where I use it. I refer to something like this to try to get students just to continue to go through the process, whether or not they quote unquote feel like it. So when you're struggling with students, if you don't rely on a quote like this, like how do you try to motivate them, or how do you try to get them to continue to work?
I tell them to make something awful. Make the worst thing you've ever made in your life. Just spit it out. Don't worry about whether you're inspired or not. Just make some terrible thing and it'll get out of your system. And then whatever actually inspires you will flow back in, I suppose. Or tell them to go for a walk, or just get it off your mind. Just go somewhere else. And what might happen is, out there in the real world, a spark. You might see somebody do something, or some kind of aspect of what you're experiencing out in the real world might, get you going. I used to work in factories. I know the whole idea of, just get to work, the grind, show up at the studio. Yeah, that's great and everything. But there were some days at the factory or the studio where it's like, not happening today, just not a good day. And that's fine. That's fine. It's just don't, be bossy about it, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting that the kind of the attitude here is maybe the objectionable part. I think all of us, if we make work, it's because we worked, right? So, I think one of the ways in which it's that kind of quote affected me was to kind of like encourage me to think of the studio as a place where work happens, and that work that happens involves sweeping the floors and building shelves and organizing crayons and stuff like that. And so it's something that said, like, okay, if you're not inspired, just do the work. Like, what work? And so I kind of interpreted it as, like, there's a professional place of work. It's up to you to define it. It's very difficult to define it, but it's up to you. And somebody's got to clean the paint buckets, somebody's got to straighten out the shelves. So, I kind of always took it like that.
Not with him. He probably had other people doing
that. Maybe so. Yeah. So let's go over to Brian and see what Brian has to say about this.
It's a curious quote because it's tossed around a lot. This has become sort of it's an art meme in a way, and I understand an aspect of it that is true, but there are elements of it that rub me the wrong way. First of which is it's a pejorative take on people who aren't quote professionals, which I find rather annoying. Having taught a lot and taught a lot of people who would be considered amateurs doing workshops, people who don't necessarily have a professional pursuit, but take what they do seriously in their own terms. And that rubs me the wrong way. You know, we talked about what the word amateur means. The word amateur literally means someone who does something for the love of it. That's what the word amateur means. So, I would actually like to resurrect that word and make it not pejorative, because I'm a professional amateur. I make money doing the thing that I love, and sometimes I don't make money doing the thing I love, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it either way. And I don't like that stance that the real artists are the ones who have the, like, quote, the factory job of art, and where they make money. And so that rubs me the wrong way, where he says the rest of us just get down and do the work. Like, well, those people are doing it too. They're just can fit it into a different part of their life. And so so I understand what you were saying, Jesse, in terms of the students, and telling them that you can't just sit around and wait for some motivation to strike you to do it. But I don't think that's what he's saying here. I think what he's saying is, you know, that the people who aren't real artists are people who don't get down and do the grind every day in the studio. But most people can't do that. Most people have limited time, and if, you know, we all have teaching careers, and we fill our time, you know, in the studio when we can. So that always rubbed me the wrong way. The use of the word amateur. I try to avoid that word when I can, because in fact when I teach a workshop, I tell everybody in here is an amateur, because we're all here because we love this particular art form, and some of us make money doing it, some of us don't. But that doesn't mean that you're less serious about your pursuit than I am. Even though I have more experience than you, and I have more time to do it, because I've found I've been very fortunate and privileged to make this a career. So that part always rubbed me the wrong way. The other thing that I find very curious about the quote, and it gets a little bit to what Glenn was saying about the methodology by which Chuck Close made his work being very systematic. And this is not a put down of his way of working and the conceptual nature of it, or Solowit, for example. But it's not a very inspired way of working. In other words, like, he's not finding new ideas in the process of working. Like, what he's saying there is, if you want to be inspired and find a new concept to or line of inquiry to pursue in your artwork, the way to do it is to go in and grind down every day. But that's not what he was doing. You know, he had a system through which he was making work conceptually, and the idea was, the inspiration was something that happened decades before, and he just found permutations of that specific idea in the methodology that he was using. But, you know, you don't, I would have been, if he had said that quote and then suddenly, like a week later, he's doing something very different, I'd say, oh, where did he come up with that new inspiration? But that's not what he's doing. So it's an incongruous quote in his own artistic practice. And again, I'm not saying that as a judgment of that practice. It's perfectly valid as a conceptual, and it's actually very, very interesting and intellectually engaging, that you can see the obsessiveness of the process in the paintings, in the work themselves. But it's not, he wasn't trying to discover new ideas in that process. He was trying to discover new ways of pursuing the initial inspiration. Okay, so I find the quote very unusual and curious in that manner of his working. And the other thing I think that's problematic about the quote is something that Glenn said, and I told you this as well, Jesse. And so we're in agreement on this. Work is not simply one thing. I always would tell my students, you know, I'm working all the time. If I take my dog for a walk, you know, my studio is carried with me everywhere I go. The studio is in here. And it's one of the debates that I would always have when I was a professor. I haven't been in academia for a while now, but one of the debates I always had with my colleagues within the institution was that how do you judge hard work, right? Because some people will say, well, they would say, well, I grade my students on hard work when they're working hard. And I said, well, how can you tell that they're working hard, right? It's just their hands are moving. I mean, if Bernini went in and took a sculpture class with me, he wouldn't look like he's working hard at all. He'd be done in 10 minutes. I'd say, well, you didn't work hard. But the work is sometimes here. sometimes the work is something you can't see, you can't observe, nor is it something that you can manufacture just through a physical action. That I think is problematic because there are many ways to be working. There's not a singular way to do that, and there are many ways through which the inspirational process can enter in. Obviously, what we're talking about here, the dichotomy would be if a student's just saying, or somebody who's trying to develop a studio practice, if they say, well, I'm just going to wait around for inspiration. What do they mean by that? If they're just going to say, oh, I'm just going to do nothing, and then if I get the feeling where I'm excited to go work, then I'll do so. But I don't think that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about the inspiration that will create inspiration, as in the conceptual nature of making things, okay, and the imperative intellectual activity that then results in whatever manifestation, okay. And for me, work could be sitting down reading a book of poetry, right? It could be, in fact, what I think that the way I interpret that aspect of the inspirational process is that the work in the studio is where everything starts to emerge, but that's not necessarily when the inspiration happened. The inspiration could have been something that lodged in my brain when I was visiting a museum, or when I was having a conversation with a friend who's an artist, or a book of poetry that I read, or it could be, or a newspaper article. It's if you're an artist, you're absorbing things all the time. The studio is the place where it all starts to emerge. Um, but but sometimes you need to have a break from the studio so that your process doesn't get in the way. Actually, it can actually get in the way if you're not feeding it from outside. So I think the spirit of it, I think, is I can understand what he's saying, but I think it's incongruous. I think it's a bit of a put down, which I really rubs me the wrong way, and I think it's not subtle enough. It's not nuanced or subtle enough. And however, having said all that, I think what he's describing there is the immediate feeling that you get when in the material that you're working in, you suddenly find the idea. Okay, so in other words, most of the things that the ideas that I start pursuing in my artwork happen in the act of making them. And so I always tell students, the meaning comes from making. In other words, it's but that's just where the confluence happens. So I don't think it may feel like that the work is the thing that created it, but it's actually everything else feeding through your life, and that's just where it emerges. But it's not going to emerge unless you get in the studio and do it eventually. I just think that it's a much more nuanced and complex activity than just saying, okay, I'm just gonna get in there, and if I just like grit it out and work it out, it'll happen on its own. And I would venture to guess that that's not how he ended up with the process that he had. It happened because, like, for example, he knew Solowit and had conversations with people, and conceptually it started to grow in his mind. And then he suddenly made something, said, "Oh, this is an idea," but it came from many sources. And but I do think that there are times in life as an artist where you, like Glenn said, you have to just go in and make some bad things, and then eventually one of those activities that you're performing in the studio will be the sort of the place where it all breaks out. Okay. And there's a great, have you ever read David Lynch's Catching the Big Fish? That book, it's a great little book.
I have
Really
not.
fantastic. Yeah, it's a really fantastic book.
I've read parts of it. Yeah. It is.
And that's basically what he's talking about, is like you're going fishing and you catch some small fish, and eventually catch a big one. It doesn't mean, and the book's really fantastic because he is very nuanced in his description of that process. It's not just the activity of pulling the fish in. There's all these other things. There are all these other things that you do. You're rowing around the lake. You're doing, you're looking for the spot. So the quote, although I have problems with it, I think there's something that you can pull out of it and benefit from. I just believe it takes a little bit more of a, it's, the quote isn't enough. The quote just won't contain enough in and of itself to describe that entire process. And everybody's different too. That's the other thing that Glenn said at the very beginning. I mean, not everybody's the same. I mean, some people could just, the work could be just sort of walking into the studio and looking around and walking out and going, doing something else. And then, in fact, one of the things that I do in my own studio practice, I have multiple things going on at once. Sometimes I will work on something and no idea attaches to it. I put it on the shelf, right? And a year or 2 years later, I'll see it and suddenly it pops into my mind. That's the idea. Okay. Now, the inspiration didn't happen in the act of working on the piece, but if I hadn't worked on the piece first, I wouldn't have something to attach the idea to. So everybody's different. And I even, not only is everybody different, but I've noticed, I just gave an example of one way in which it happens to me. Other times it happens almost immediately. As soon as I put my hand into the material or a pencil on paper, whatever it might be, sometimes it just happens really quickly. But it's not because I did the grind. It's because something else mysterious was happening in that process. And so I think there are multiple ways to think of work, what work is, and it takes some conversation with an individual to see how that happens for them. This is why, as artists, one of the most fun things to do is visit another artist studio and talk to them about what they do, right? Because
I can
right?
attest to that, being in your studio.
It's a lot of fun. Yeah. It's the biggest thrill in the world as an artist to have that, to observe that and suddenly realize, oh, that's something that I've never tried, and maybe I can employ that particular approach to thinking through material. But anyway, that's my take on the quote.
Yeah, there's I mean, one thing that both of you touched on that I think is really interesting. I've always been fascinated in this idea. Leo Steinberg talks about it in Other Criteria, is the need for artwork to contain hard work in the mind of the viewer and in the mind of the population to justify its existence. And if you look at, like, for instance, Gordon Matta Clark or Richard Serra, you're confronted with images of hard work, right? Like, these are like, shirtless men sweating and, performing acts of labor. And then this, monumental thing is the result of that labor. But there's an interesting kind of phenomena that feels kind of attached to this to me. And one area that this showed up, and I wonder if this connects to Saul Witt at all, which is when I was reading about Jackson Pollock, I don't read that much about Jackson Pollock, but one thing that kept seeming to come up in art history, conversations about him, art criticism about him, is how he would sort of like that he worked so hard on these and he made so many of these drip paintings that he mastered, like it was almost described as if he developed like a language in the same way that like Tolkien developed a language for, the Lord of the Rings or something like that. And that he developed like a calligraphy with the marks that he was making. And there's nothing wrong. I don't doubt that. But in some ways it seemed like a justification that wasn't necessary. Like we can see that so obviously. And so to discuss it like as if it's, I mean, everybody that is mark making on a paper is developing a calligraphy. So of course, why wouldn't Jackson Pollock? And it almost seemed to me like to echo that Leo Steinberg conversation of like, well, just in case you feel like these Jackson Pollocks don't deserve to exist, here's a little evidence of hard work, just to move the conversation along, And so I always kind of took exception to that. And I wonder, did you find that was the conversation with Saul Witt? Like, was there anything, Glenn, there in the work or in the response to the work or in the studio that was a conversation about like how, because a lot of those are super labor intensive installations, right? They take multiple people, multiple pencil sharpeners, like it's a system of work. So, but was that at all part of the conversation?
No, never actually. He would get up in the morning, go to the studio very diligently, work on his, he already had the idea in his head. He knew the course that it was supposed to run. get it done that day. And, you know, we all knew that he would just go in and work. He was just working. You know, one of the funny things, he never said anything about it himself anyway, but we could see it, you know. I think a lot of people just assume with Saul Witt, he just makes these little designs, gives them to other people to do the work. But the reality is he would do that all day long. So there's like thousands and thousands of designs. It still hasn't, you know, made its way out there. So yeah. And he often, and I think later on, he would give a lot of credit to the fabricators. Like if you would go see some of his later exhibitions, on the text, you'd see, you know, he would give credit to those workers, and he often would say, you know, things like, "Oh, they do better scribbles than me," or you know, he was like, he used their work in a way. He was like, "Oh, I know these guys are really good, and I'm glad they could do it better than me, and it makes my work better," right? But he also, towards the end, especially, gave them the credit. I don't know if that really answers your question, but
Sure, yeah. And Brian, what do you, are there any artworks, Brian, that the labor of which resonate with you, that just the sheer like volume of work somehow illuminates the concept for you?
Well, that's a good question. I think one of the problems with that topic is, what does hard work mean? What does the word work mean?
Hmm.
Because work can be hidden. It doesn't necessarily. So, for example, one of my favorite quotes is by Edna St. Vincent Millay, and she said, "It takes a practiced hand to make an artless gesture." So the thing that looks easy and effortless and required no work is an indication of previous thought and effort that is not apparent in the final thing, unless you're conversant in that medium. So you know, somebody who can dash off a drawing of something with seemingly little effort, it's not because there was no effort, it's because you can't, the effort was something that was embedded in their mind, in their process. And so the accumulation of work is something that I don't necessarily evaluate, because I work under the sort of generous assumption that anybody who's engaging in activity has put in the work somewhere, that you don't necessarily have to be aware of it, what that work is. The other thing, of course, is that it's not just Saul Witt who employed lots of assistants. Throughout human history, people have employed lots of assistants. This is not a new thing. This is, you know, Rubens to Bernini to Lysippus in ancient Greece. They all had hundreds of assistants over their lifetimes. And that the work, there are two kinds of work there. There's the labor, and there's the work of the mind. And the work of the mind in a finished thing may not be the person who actually did the physical work. So for me, I actually find the communal aspect of artistic production to be incredibly fascinating, because even the work of the mind is a communal activity. None of us have had a completely original thought. All of our thoughts are the result of a lot of mental labor of a lot of people over a long period of time. And so there's no, getting to your question, is there any particular body of work or works that fascinate me because of work? I would say everything that I've ever seen in my life. It's all connected in some fashion. I mean, we just, you know, Glenn made a very interesting connection right at the beginning between Chuck Close and Saul Witt. Those bodies of work are connected. They're intertwined, and of course it's much more complicated than that, because they're not the only two, right? There are lots of other people who entered into their process in some fashion. So this is a sort of romantic. I mean, what we're talking about here is this very romantic idea of the lone artist in his studio, the lone genius in the studio, getting a flash of inspiration. That's bullshit. We're allowed to swear on this podcast. Uh, that's bullshit. It's bullshit.
Definitely
Always
100% all swear words all the time.
okay. But it is right. I think we all agree on that. Based on this conversation, I think we all agree on that. It's not. It's never been that way ever. And I think we should move away from that somewhat because it romanticizes something that puts people who are young or not necessarily young but beginning in a dangerous position where they think that okay, it's up to them to just be the receptors of this this genius alone. That's not how it works. There's that quote that the muses are hovering above looking for an open, a place to enter, right? Somebody working in their studio or whatever that might be, but they're not doing it alone. We never have, and we never will. So work is a cumulative thing, both in your own life and in the lives of others. And it's those kinds of confluences as well that fascinate me. I've actually, speaking of this idea of like inspiration, right? This has happened to me multiple times, going to a colleague, friend's exhibition and looking at something and then suddenly getting an idea for something I wanted to do in my studio. And I didn't get it until I was there in the presence of what they were doing. And you wouldn't necessarily know it by looking. It wasn't, it's not plagiaristic. For example, I remember very clearly this happening to me at the exhibition of a painter friend of mine. And she had this great series of paintings that were painted in conjunction with a composer, and there's music and painting. And for whatever reason, I just got this flash in my mind of an idea that I had been searching for the answer to. And that's when it came to me. It was because of one of her paintings. So the work was her work and my work and everybody else. So maybe that's like a little too facile of an answer to what you asked, but and maybe dodging it a little bit, but I think it's evident everywhere if you're open to seeing it and being engaged with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most important things is that, like, these quotes, these tips, these tricks, these like easy ways to understand the process by which things are made, by which things happen, that are very complicated, very multi-layered. Oftentimes these quotes, they're just not nuanced enough, and they're so open for misinterpretation, without a long form conversation, which this is, right? So without the long form conversation to kind of follow them up and clarify all the nuance that the kind of short form quote misses. So while it might be clever, while it might be funny, it might be meaningful in certain ways, it's always kind of missing the nuance that it needs to really describe what's happening, and the multiple ways that it's happening. And I think, most artists have, I feel the same way, right? It's like I can't read books without thinking of sculptures or paintings or drawings to make. I can't walk outside without, it's always there, searching, and I'm always looking for, not even consciously, but it's like it occurs to me when I see something, a stick, a rock, a dog, a cat, like it's like how is that something that I could be making later? And it happens in a very natural way, and I don't know if that's inspiration or not. I don't know if that's just like inspiration or brain function or what it is, but it's just a constant, like, kind of reactionary process that I'm just like accumulating. And anyway, but yeah, I think it's really interesting that how we went through this. I guess we have to thank Chuck Close for making the quote.
Can I say one more thing though? Because
Sure.
I think one of the dangers with the reductivist kind of quote like this is
Yeah.
that as instructors, we all have students, right? I don't have the kind of situation you two have because you're more fully engaged with the life of a student over a long period of time. And I'm out of that environment. I just do workshops. So this doesn't happen to me in the way that it happens to you. But one of the dangers of that quote is that if you have a student who's stuck, or it is not, they don't have an idea, and you say, well, you just aren't in the studio enough working. Well, what if they go in and they work for 3 weeks and they come back to you and say, this didn't work. I still don't have any ideas. Now what do you tell them? You see, that's the problem with reductivism, is it not only reduces, it distills the subtlety down to nothing, but it also gives you no means to give advice or feedback that would be useful to that individual human being in their own experience, of which there are billions of possibilities, right? And so it's dangerous in that regard.
Totally. What you were saying, the work is being in your head. That's really where the work. That's where everything really happens. This whole idea that everything's about mechanical production. I think is just the wrong way to go. Teaching, younger generations of makers. Because it's not, and it's important to tell them that they might get stuck. I think if you don't have anything. You just don't have anything. It sucks.
Yeah.
Well,
getting back to that, the Leo Steinberg's Other Criteria. One of the best chapters in that book is a chapter titled "The Eye is a Part of the Mind," and that's what he's talking about in there. It's the physical manifestation that other people get to engage with is just the physical manifestation of this line of inquiry that your mind is taking through the material. And obviously you have to develop some facility with whatever materials you want to utilize, but that's a given. I mean, that's just a given. I mean, if you want to be a poet, you need to have a vocabulary. I mean, we all know this, and you need to have a pencil in your hand. Okay, you need to know how to write. That's just a given. Everybody knows that. But finding a way to deploy all of those tools, that's in here. And there are multiple ways to access that.
One of the things that I do often in class, and my students, I don't know how they ever feel about it. They never tell me exactly how they feel about it, but I use sports analogies a lot. Brian knows this too. In the process of, let's say, like figure drawing, like developing a procedure and a way to approach the figure, repetition can be an important part of that. And it speaks to this kind of Kobe Bryant, like Mamba mentality method of preparation where Kobe Bryant would constantly be preaching, like, he shoots 500-600 shots, 1,000 shots a day, just doing things that like nobody's arm could withstand in order to create like a muscle memory that, just brought him to the top of the league. He talks about doing blackout workouts where you just work out so long that you no longer even know that you're working out, that it just merges with the next day. And this can be useful in the arts because some people don't understand the amount of work that it takes to develop certain aesthetics, to develop certain looks or finishes, or even just to understand certain concepts that are related to process and approach. But that that's not the height of art, is it? Right. And so there's a tough balance to strike between just kind of like mindlessly going to the gym and just shooting, and having that work of the mind, as Brian said, be the thing that governs the work that you put in. And if you do get into that scenario where you're just involving yourself in repetition, you're just showing up and doing the work, you can guarantee yourself that you're not innovating like that, right? Like if you're not reflecting on your work, if you're not exposing your work and your thoughts to outside influences, to other differing opinions, stuff like that, that then you're just going to be mired in your own process, and that can be fine. Again, like it's not that there's necessarily a problem with that, but it's not the full expression of what art can be. And I think that the quote kind of misses that point as well, which is like, like the way that you said, Brian, like what if a student goes to the studio and still, doesn't become inspired. And it's like, well, what if they do become inspired, but they still have more work to do? Like they still have a lot more thinking to do, where they still have a lot more progress to make before they're finished. And some of that's not just going to be involving yourself in more repetition of what you're already doing. Yeah,
because the other thing is that anything that has a high degree of manual skill required to be proficient in it, the fetishization of that can also become a way of avoiding the fear of doing something bad and failing at something, which is absolutely necessary to be good at anything. You have to fail. You have to, that's just a reality. And you can fetishize something so much that it's an avoidance of some other fear that you have. So I mean, I think we all have experienced that as artists. You know, we pick something, we get good at it. We're like, this is okay. This is my territory. I'm good at this. And you know, pushing yourself out of that is required. And I think that gets to the point you made about the student. The flip side, of course, is what they do get inspired, but they don't have the skill yet, and they then realize, okay, I need to be good at something. They start to fetishize that. Now they've just pushed the inspiration right out of the room. So it's a very difficult process being an artist, but it's also fun.
Turns out it's a
not
lot of
bad.
hard work.
I mean, look, I don't even like the word failure. The only failure is the failure to try. It's like there is this failures. Let's say this: the failure to try and failure to learn through the process. If you're recalcitrant and you do something that didn't work and you don't learn the lesson from it, well, but there's no such thing as failure. If you think of it, it's all just a part of a process. Some things are going to emerge with more inspiration than others. It's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. So that's, again, this gets back to the problem with reductivist quotes. When you have that sort of simplicity to a process, it ignores all of the other things that go into it. It's success, it's failure, it's reflection, it's sometimes just clearing the mind and doing nothing, just whatever it could be. And it's employing people with the skills to know when to shift is the key thing. Say, okay, I'm working too much, and you just get out of it, or I'm not working enough, whatever that work looks like. That is, I think, is the primary skill, and it's a lifelong thing that I don't think anybody ever masters.
I think it's also important to teach, or I don't know if it can be taught actually, but to get them to notice those moments that might, push them. And it's not just doing 500 three tosses. It's like paying attention to the room, paying attention to what else is going on. And then suddenly, like in basketball, really the art is the plays, like going from one guy to the next. That's, the execution is one thing, but the art is in the play. And you're not going to make a beautiful play if you're not paying attention to the room,
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'll overlook the fact that you called a basketball play free tosses. But...
Oh yeah.
No problem.
I was trying to say 3 point.
Okay. Yeah. 3 pointers.
No. I'm familiar with the, but I'm also not a very good basketball player. So.
That's okay. Yeah, but that's a good point. Like I feel like a lot of my students bring in work that I feel is more inspired than they feel is inspired. And I see the potential in it that they feel is like somehow flat, and I get all excited, and they're worried about like some technical detail. Like they're like, oh, I feel like the shading's off here, and I'm like, why is that what you're focused on? And it's almost like they have an urge sometimes to find some kind of like technical issue that they can solve through hard work, rather than to pursue the kind of like intellectual inspiration that they were onto. And that's a good way of putting it, where it's like, well, how do you teach them to elevate the mundane? How do you teach them to pay attention to when they're actually inspired and take advantage of it? Because maybe sometimes they're inspired, but they can't harness that inspiration or something like that. That's an interesting kind of way to put it.
Yeah, I don't think we need to just talk about students. I think that's true for all of us.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
We're not.
Right.
We think we know our strengths and weaknesses, but we don't really.
Yeah,
we need the community to tell us.
Yeah.
Because we're doing something that's resonating with people, and we don't know, because we're looking at something else. We're focused on another goal, and we think that just doing the manual labor will fix it, and we don't need to
Yeah,
fix it.
yeah.
It's perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's kind of the problem that you identified with the quote, where like I was somehow creating like a hierarchy, and like there's no reason for that, right? Like we're all struggling with that same problem, maybe at different levels, but ultimately exactly the same issue, forever, right?
Sure.
Yeah, very good. Well, I think at this point we can say we've definitely covered some ground with this. It's a really interesting quote. It's one I've leaned on for a long time, but it's definitely one that I'll rethink now. I'll still say thanks to Chuck Close for letting us have it, for putting it out there.
I'm starting to wonder if all quotes are bad. Maybe we should.
Yeah, all quotes are bad. No more quotes. Stop quoting.
Like there's the Picasso steal like an artist, like I don't know.
Yeah, shut up, Picasso.
Many bad quotes.
Let's do this monthly. Just pick a quote and tear it apart.
Exactly. Yeah. We'll have to rename the podcast, but that's no problem. Well, thank you so much, Glenn and Brian. I really appreciate your time.
Oh, that was a lot of fun. That was good. That was a great conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. It was really enlightening, and I hope we can do it again.
Definitely.
Thanks,
okay.
Jeff. Merry Christmas.
Good night.
Holidays.
Merry Christmas.
Yep.